Ecclesiastes chapter 4. Again, I saw all the oppressions that are done under the sun, and behold the tears of the oppressed, and they had no one to comfort them. On the side of their oppressors there was power, and there was no one to comfort them. And I thought the dead who had already died more fortunate than the living who are still alive. But better than both is he who has not yet been and has not seen the evil deeds that are done under the sun. Then I saw that all toil and all skill in work come from a man's envy of his neighbor. This also is vanity and a striving after wind. The fool folds his hands and eats his own flesh. Better is a handful of quietness than 2 hands full of toil and a striving after wind. Again, I saw vanity under the sun. One person who has no other, either son or brother, yet there is no end to all his toil, and his eyes are never satisfied with riches, so that he never asks, for whom am I toiling and depriving myself of pleasure? This also is vanity and an unhappy business. 2 are better than 1, because they have a good reward for their toil. For if they fall, one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him who is alone when he falls and has not another to lift him up. Again, if 2 lie together, they keep warm, but how can one keep warm alone? And though a man might prevail against one who is alone, 2 will withstand him. A 3-fold cord is not quickly broken. Better was a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who no longer knew how to take advice. For he went from prison to the throne, though in his own kingdom he had been born poor. I saw all the living who move about under the sun, along with that youth who was to stand in the king's place. There was no end of all the people, all of whom he led, yet those who come later will not rejoice in him. Surely this also is vanity and a striving after wind. So in Ecclesiastes, Solomon is the writer, and he wants us to understand the reality of life on earth. If God is not in your life, if you are absorbed by this world, trying to find your purpose under the sun, slowly pushing away from God, what's left is vanity, the vanity of earthly existence that ends in death. For rich or poor, smart or not, known or unknown, the end is death. There is a better way to spend your time here. Put God in your life and keep Him there at the very center of your existence and activity and interaction with people and events. Take mature responsibility for all your earthly duties. Know that there will be good times and bad, but be certain God is in your life. Christ gave His life to make that choice possible. Ecclesiastes chapter 4. I want to share with you some observations from the news just the past few weeks. Allen, Texas, Farmington, New Mexico, Syria, Gaza, Israel, Ukraine, the border crisis, storms, shootings, trafficking, drug abuse, pornography, on and on. Now, look at the first verse in Ecclesiastes chapter 4. Again, I saw all the oppressions that are done under the sun, and behold the tears of the oppressed, and they had no one to comfort them. On the side of their oppressors there was power, and there was no one to comfort them. Since the entrance of sin into the world, there has never been a time of perfect peace. No oppression, no war, no tragedy, no conflict, just utopia. It seemed to Solomon, and it seems to students of history, and it seems to us, there are always powerful people who oppress, use people, do violence toward the weak, and the weak have no comfort under the sun. This opening verse in chapter 4 reminds us of the tears of the oppressed and the perceived but corrupt victory of the oppressors. It was so bad, as perceived in the mind of Solomon when he wrote this. At one point he said, the people who are already dead are the most fortunate. Similarly, he expressed his emotion in verse 3. But better than both is he who has not yet been and has not seen the evil deeds that are done under the sun. Well, your first impression reading the opening verses of chapter 4 is this doesn't make you feel good. No joy in these words. But here's what's contained in these opening verses of Ecclesiastes 4. The reality of life under the sun. Now, what would make that 10 times worse? Living here under the sun without God in your life. You recall I said back when we started this study, sometimes Solomon rattles us with these bold statements leading to the conclusion there is no heaven here on earth. This place under the sun is not paradise and nobody can make it so. King or fool. Life under the sun is characterized by conflict and misery and strife and violence and murder, where the poor and weak suffer under the oppression of the strong, the evil, the powerful. So if you attempt to find the good life here under the sun, there will be times of intense disappointment and despair about life under the sun. We live on fallen ground. There are people here on earth who are selfish, ungodly, hypocritical, corrupt, who care nothing about their fellow man. We see today what Solomon saw then, and it hurts us as it hurt him. And we cannot escape the ugly side of life under the sun. As you continue through the book of Ecclesiastes and read further into the New Testament, you come to good news. We are only here for a little while. God invites us to trust and obey His Son, Jesus, and that way of life is the only way to have hope and joy while living under the sun. The only way to keep our sanity and have any hope is to fear God and keep His commandments while we're here, so that when we leave here in death, there will be a perfect existence with the Creator. How long? Forever. Now, looking here at Ecclesiastes chapter 4, if it helps you to have an outline of the text, in this chapter, life under the sun is described in terms of oppression, verses 1 to 3, rivalry, verses 4 to 6, isolation, verses 7 to 12, the problem of government, 13 to 16. Solomon continues to put before his readers the rigid, oppressive realism of life under the sun. Without God, it is insufferable. The next part of this concerns rivalry and carnal competition, often observed in the workplace. Verse 4, Then I saw that all toil and all skill in work come from a man's envy of his neighbor. This also is vanity and a striving after wind. It sounds to me like Solomon had these points of awakening where he would look over here and see something, and he would realize how things really are under the sun. And in his despair, he would write about it, perhaps with some exaggeration or hyperbole. He admires toil and skill. Then, upon further experience and thought, he realizes that a lot of toil and skill often comes from envy, competition, trying to do more and have more than others. Now, I put that word often in there. Solomon reached this place of frustration where he said, all skill is work, and it comes from a man's envy of his neighbor. In Hebrew literature, here and in Psalms, writers would express their emotions often through exaggeration, broad, sweeping statements. So let's consider competition per se is not evil. But when doing better than others becomes your substantial motivation, when you are overpowered by the desire to do better than someone else, that's vanity. The striving after win. Because in the end, everybody dies, and in death, the competition is over. And everybody is equal, an even playing field in the cemetery. Let me speak for a few minutes to this subject of competition. It is not a creation of Americans. Trying to outdo another is quite ancient. In sports, we accept competition as noble and energizing and entertaining and expensive for audiences. In the Lord's church, however, there is to be exactly no competition. It has no place. There are higher motives to energize us and help us to be united and work together. The New Testament passages that address attitude, interpersonal relationships, and unselfish humility are quite clear. There's no place for competition in the Lord's church. Of course, Solomon is not talking about the church. He's talking about what he saw in skilled workers in the workplace in his time. Perhaps you see it in your office or your workplace. Competition is part of what Solomon saw as oppressive and depressing here on earth. Rivalry is born and is fed by pride and can quickly lead to strife and corruption. Solomon saw something else under the sun. The fool folds his hands and eats his own flesh. Again, some exaggeration. Some people, seeing oppression and carnal competition, just go wild and just decide to sit down and give up and do nothing, and doing nothing becomes all-consuming. If you get focused on what is happening here on earth, leaving God and the gospel out, you can quickly be taken to despair and depression, and you may just quit life. That's foolish. And it happens to some people that they just fold their hands, have nothing to eat, and were it not for friends and family or government programs, death would be swift. See, if your life is just focused here under the sun, without God, it is vanity and may regress to extremes in behavior and living. There is oppression, suffering, envy, strife, and then you die. But there's a better way. Verse 6 says, better is a handful of quietness than 2 hands full of toil and a striving after wind. Peace of mind is far superior to being oppressive and fierce and a compulsive competitor. Peace of mind, the New Testament says, peace in life, peace eternally, found in Jesus Christ. Next, one of the most notable passages in Ecclesiastes concerning being alone, isolation, in verses 7 through 12. First, let's not neglect the primary meaning of this text in the greater context of Ecclesiastes. Solomon saw people on the earth often living in very lonely conditions socially, perhaps because of oppression or rivalry. That loneliness did not certainly fulfill their purpose in life. Or Solomon saw people having no family, nobody to share with. This becomes another example of how this world, life here, has various elements of built-in limitation and grief. Some people are very alone. Out of this observation comes Solomon's wisdom that while we're here on earth, we need each other. We need relationships with people. Otherwise, the vanity of life on earth is just darker. Primary to Ecclesiastes is we need God, but God says we need each other. Good companionship is something God intends for us. Two are better than one. In the arena of physical endeavors, this holds true. Some jobs require two, lifting your side and your partner lifting the other side. In matters of finance and accounting, it is common wisdom, for example, when money is involved, for there to be more than just one. In education, medicine, transportation, when you fly, there's a pilot and a co-pilot. Two are better than one. When Jesus sent disciples out, it was clear what he thought. Two are better than one. God has provided for our social needs by making it possible for us to live and work together, one alongside another. Those who are alone suffer one of the indignities of living here on fallen ground. Solomon pauses from his sad monologue about life under the sun to tell us something that we ought to seek that will help us. Two are better than one. Companionship, interaction with other people. And there may be in us a misplaced independence, causing us to claim, I don't need anybody. I am sufficient. I can take care of myself without anyone else. Well, that sounds strong and courageous and responsible, but God put us in families. Jesus built a church telling us to love and help each other. Two are better than one. Working together, we get more done. We defend each other. We help each other get up when we are down. We are encouraged and productive, and there's more joy in the labor with good, healthy teamwork. Verses 13 to 16. Better was a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who no longer knew how to take advice. Solomon saw this under the sun, poor but wise young men willing to learn, in contrast to old foolish men no longer willing to take advice and yet being in positions to govern people. We may see that. We may be at one end or the other of that statement, youth or age. From this we learn being old and having power doesn't necessarily mean that you're wise or spiritually healthy. It is never smart to stop taking advice. Solomon says that some make the trip from prison to the throne all the way. But no matter if you close your mind when you get there, if you stop taking advice, if you think you've learned everything you need to learn, you may be old and rich and powerful, but foolish. There is much discussion in the commentaries and resource materials about the distinct possibility that in these last few verses in chapter 4, Solomon is talking about maybe his own situation in some ways, his personal history, particularly in verse 16. He led all these people, yet after his reign, the glory of the kingdom was tarnished by his sons. There is biblical evidence that Solomon didn't act wisely as he saw the kingdom passing from his control. Now he says, surely this also is another example of vanity and a striving after wind here under the sun. Life on earth without God just runs into all these disappointments and frustrations. We occupy fallen ground, oppression, despair that may paralyze us, loneliness, rivalry, old men who no longer take advice. Yet, Solomon repeats the conclusion: vanity, a striving after wind. I have a few final observations I'll give you in just a second or two. Points of application. A model of work based on rivalry can lead to oppression and loneliness and division. See, I'm thinking all of this is connected here in chapter 4. Solomon didn't see unconnected realities. He saw life under the sun as pursued by men without God. A model of work based on rivalry can lead to oppression and loneliness and division. As Christians, we believe what is civil and responsible and peaceful is for all of us to follow Jesus Christ and work together in that endeavor every day. Number 2, life is best lived with good companions. There is a social mutuality and companionship God intended for our joy, our productivity, our encouragement spiritually. The first time we see this is in Genesis, where God saw that Adam was alone and gave him a wife. In the New Testament, Christians are together in local churches, edifying one another, helping each other. We all have close family and close friends and each other to help us while we live here under the sun. We are fellow travelers, and we are well served in forming good, healthy friendships so that there is united strength and teamwork, hopefully with God at the center of what we do together. Number 3, a king, president, or any leader is best served when surrounded by wise men, even if they're younger. Matthew Henry has said, "He is truly wise and prudent who continues to respect and listen to sound thinking, even if expressed by men far younger." He went on to say, "A king who is foolish, stubborn, and willfully resistant to youth may become impoverished." We can learn something from young people. I teach young preachers in a venue of a few days each year, but when I do that, I always learn from them. Number 4, better is a handful of quietness than 2 hands full of toil and a striving after wind. Did you hear a few years ago about the Canadian couple who won the lottery? 11 million. And they gave it all away. Alan and Violet Large. I'm not going to ever recommend the lottery, but this illustrates something. They won millions and gave it all away. When asked about this bizarre act of generosity, the man said, "It's not that I'm such a great person. I just don't want all the hassle." He was content. And he knew that when you have a lot with wealth, there is a certain amount of stress that can rob you of quietness and peace. That's Ecclesiastes chapter 4.